G'day ladies and gentlemen, ScottyD here from the Australia's Tabletop Wargame Network, and welcome back to another installment in our Competitive Focus series. Alrighty ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the ATWN once again with myself, ScottyD. It is wonderful to bring you another video for our Competitive Focus series where we look at the more competitive side of playing Warhammer 40k, whether you're doing it a bit more competitively with your mates or you're focusing on events and trying to do the best you can in the more competitive settings of Warhammer 40k. But before we jump into today's video, I want to thank each and every one of you who have been liking our videos, sharing them with your friends, and subscribing to the ATWN. We really appreciate it now that we've hit over 1,600 subscribers here on YouTube, which is absolutely phenomenal, and it is wonderful to be able to have each of you joining us along this wonderful journey of the ATWN. So let's jump in, because today's video I'm going to be talking a bit about figuring out your playstyle as a player and trying to lean into that. Now, I've really come across this kind of recently because, since the last competitive focus video that I've done where we looked at my Deathwatch and how that list worked, I've played probably about a half dozen more games with it, and as well as the testing games prior to that video, I've really found that I've been basically pushing my face up against a grindstone with it. And really, it's come down to that it is not my type of army. Like, it doesn't lean into my play style particularly well. So I kind of want to share how I came to that and kind of why I think that is and what my actual play style is that I typically lean more towards and what I'm looking at going forward. But we're going to primarily focus on like how you go about figuring out your play style as a competitive 40k player or just as a 40k player in general. So where I found that I was struggling with my Deathwatch list was because it was so melee heavy with a little bit of shooting. I found that I would make staging errors quite frequently with where I'd position my kill teams and my Deathwatch veterans trying to get into combat. And so whilst I was able to do it some of the times to do it effectively or get myself out of jail, there were times where I just completely scuffed it and basically had lost the game from deployment. And in a melee focused list, that's very easy to do because you don't want to expose your melee units. You don't want to give your opponents opportunities to actually interact with them, to do damage to them before you're able to connect in close combat. And so therefore being able to unintentionally exposing them and giving your opponent angles to get shots on and do the damage means that it diminishes your ability to do damage in melee and things like that. That really was a struggle for me to pick up staging effectively. Now, on WTC terrain, I found it was a little bit easier to do than on GW because GW terrain is a lot more open compared to WTC terrain. So I did get like some very close games on WTC with it. I did get my only win with the list on WTC, but there's a combination of a few things with that win. Unfortunately, my opponent clocked out, as well as I won as well due to a challenger card and getting the right challenger card at the right time and flipping the result. So I'm going to have another video in this series looking at challenger cards and sharing my thoughts on them as well. This is really what led me to a point where I've played 10 games with this style of list and it's just not working for me. And so it's like, okay, cool. Whilst I've figured out a good build or a relatively good build, it just doesn't work for my playstyle. And so even though I can get some games close to the goal of 70 points, my playstyle doesn't work for it. And so I found that there's actually 4 aspects that I want to go into and share with you guys that you can use to figure out what your playstyle is. And whilst these might seem like they're hard and fast rules, they're more sliders. So if you think about it, 2 of the things that are opposing to each other are at each end of the slider, and you're somewhere in the middle, right? Or you could be fully more towards one end than the other. So that's kind of the approach we're going to take with this one. So there are 4 different elements I want to talk about when it comes to your playstyle, and that is the level of mobility, shooting versus melee, elite versus horde, and damage output. Now, some of those might be like, well, you've got to have some of these, and some of them are like, well, of course, but there are ways that you can tailor that, right? So I want to jump in and we're going to talk about mobility to start off with. Every iteration of the game today, the game is at its core at the competitive level won and lost through movement. Whether you are using strong movement characteristics on your units, whether you're advancing, whether you're deep striking, whether you're infiltrating and scouting. A whole bunch of different abilities in the game enable movement. Now, of course, you've got to get to different places for various secondaries and get to various objectives and hold them on the table. So, of course, movement is going to be very important. However, when you are figuring out your playstyle, it's going to ultimately come down to the form of mobility that you enjoy playing with. But it's up to your personal taste as well as what your preferred army has on offer. And this might be the thing. You might find an army you really love playing doesn't have the way that you enjoy playing mobility or playing some of these other factors. So, do you want a highly mobile army where you've got a lot of strong movement characteristics across the entire army that are very fast, get up in your opponent's face? For example, Blood Angels, lots of jump packs. They're able to get up in their opponent's face very quickly and engage with them on their terms. Or do you only want a couple of units that you use for scoring? A couple of units of jump pack intercessors to go skirmish in the midfield early game, for example, or maybe some Outriders. Or, a couple of other units that you could use, Vanguard Veterans for Marines, a few others. Being a Marine player, I'm going to use a lot of Marine examples, so bear with me. I will try and spice in some Necron ones too, just to spice things up. But, if you don't go down the heavy movement characteristic route, do you have average movement, but you have abilities like advance and shoot or advance and charge that you're making use of? Are you going to be making use of deep strike heavy units or infiltrate and scout units? Or are you going to take someone like a Phobos Captain that has a redeploy so you can reposition your units to be more effective during deployment? Of course, that one can depend on whether you want to bait and switch and put some stuff into strategic reserves that may have the deep strike keyword, so then you've got an extra drop, throw it into strat reserves, deep strikes down turn 2 instead of being deployed on the field. Things like that you can really think about. There are always going to be some armies in the game and some detachments in the game that are going to lead themselves a lot better to this than others. A lot of armies in the game will have some form of infiltrate or scout nowadays, but things like deep strike is a little rarer, stuff like redeployments are a little rarer, higher movement characteristics will depend on your army choice and the units you're taking. So really, some factions are going to be limited in their options, whereas others are going to have almost every option under the sun. Space Marines, for example, case in point. So it's going to come down to your army choice and your detachment choice, as you may find you'll have some limitations that your army might be limited to. But say, for example, like Blackspear Task Force, we've got the site-to-site teleportation strat to be able to pick up 2 kill team units or 1 Adeptus Astartes infantry unit, put it in strategic reserves, it gains deep strike, and can deep strike in the following turn from strat reserves. So there is that mobility that is enabled in that detachment that maybe Deathwatch or regular Space Marines mightn't have access to otherwise within that detachment due to detachment limitations not being able to take scouts, for example. So you're paying a bit more for your infiltrate or your scouting units. So maybe you're like, well, I take veterans and I use that strat anyway. Personally, for me, I do find that I like a mix of some fast movement units, so some jump pack intercessors are usually quite good, or maybe some Outriders, as well as a couple of different deployment methods. Infiltrate's really handy as well as scout. Also, redeployments can be helpful as well. Deep strike can be handy. Getting some Deathwatch Terminators into someone's backlines and doing some clearing is always nice too. But there's a whole bunch of different ways you can do that within Marines. Some armies like Necrons, for example, really have got some deep striking units, some redeployment, and some infiltrators, but you're more limited in the options you have available. Next up, we come to shooting versus melee. Now, this aspect comes down to whether you want to be engaging your opponent at range or you want to be up close and personal getting into hand-to-hand combat in melee. Now, with this one, you can go either all in on one aspect. You can be a tower player and just full send it on the shooting. Or you can be world eaters where you have maybe 1 or 2 shooting units, but you really spend the majority of your points on combat. And you really focus on getting into the fight, getting into your opponent's faces. Or you can go, a little bit of each. You could go a little bit of shooting with a lot of combat, or you can go a lot of shooting with a little bit of combat, or you can have equal amounts of both. It's really up to you, and it really will come down to, again, your faction choice as well as to what you have available. Now, with that faction choice, you can choose detachments that enable your shooting to be a lot better or enable your melee. So, for example, for Marines, Firestorm enables a lot more close range shooting, whereas something like Vanguard enables more longer range shooting. And Stormlance handles a lot more close combat. That advance and charge enabling you to get up into your opponent's grills, up in their face, getting into combat, and just doing a bunch of damage up close and personal. Now, you've got to make sure that when you are choosing between these, that we're going to talk a bit about damage output in a little bit later as one of the options, but you need to be able to understand the skill sets that come in with choosing these. Melee, you need to understand where to stage your units so that you're not exposing them to being shot at if you're playing against a shooting heavy army, how to use ruins to your advantage using line of sight, controlling where you place your models so that you're not exposing them in fire lanes. Now, if you're a shooting player, you're going to use your movement to get into fire lanes so that you're able to control those shots, so that you're able to control, where you're putting your firepower, what you're engaging with, when you're engaging with it. Now, for me, my personal preference on this one is been more of the shooting side, so I like about 60-70% shooting in my list, with the rest of it being some melee in there, with a couple of strong melee units, maybe some jump pack intercessors for some early skirmishing, but also something like Blade Guard or Deathwatch veterans in there as well, to actually do some counter punch, some counter assault if my opponent gets too close into my grills. I've got then a combat unit that can actually beat off my opponent from my shooting units and free them up to be able to do what they are meant to be doing. So that is really kind of the first two elements. And of course, we can't go past talking about terrain and sight lines and staging and all that without talking about today's video sponsor, Tip Top Terrain. Now, Tip Top Terrain are an Australian-based company who produce quality MDF terrain that is both affordable and easy to store. They make their terrain in both WTC and GW competitive layouts, ensuring that no matter what format of terrain you're playing on, you can grab a terrain set from them and be set and ready to go to play that style of game in preparation for tournaments you're attending, or if you just have a preference for your home games on playing WTC or playing on GW layouts, then you're gonna have access to that terrain as well. We use their terrain on stream when we do live tournament coverage, and we've just recently painted up their latest GW terrain set, which has been absolutely phenomenal. We had it on stream at the Sydney Winter GT. It's not fully finished painted, but it is looking great so far. Really looking forward to getting it finished. Now, Tip Top Terrain don't just produce terrain, they also produce neoprene gaming mats, bases for your terrain that match their mats as well. Also gaming aids such as Blood for the Blood God dice tokens, so that you can know what your rolls allow you to actually do with your Blood for the Blood God roll, or even an Adeptus Sororitas miracle dice counter, things like that. And so if you want to check out any of the product that Dan creates at Tip Top Terrain, make sure to check out their link down below. Check them out over on Etsy or on their web store. If you end up grabbing anything from them, make sure to let them know that the ATWN sent you. So the third aspect when it comes to figuring out your play style is Elite versus Horde. Now, this might be a little bit of a misnomer, but I'll explain why. This aspect really comes down to not just the number of miniatures that you are putting on the table, but also the quality of them. Typically in 40k, elite miniatures like Adeptus Custodes or Space Marines, which you could consider to be not necessarily elite, but more elite leaning, have got decent profiles and higher performing functionality rather than lower profiles and lower performing stat lines such as Orcs, for example, that don't really have a solid defensive profile. Now, when I am talking about Elite versus Horde here, I'm not just talking about their defensive strats. Whilst yes, it can determine whether you have more models on the field because their defensive abilities, such as their toughness and wounds and saves, or their just defensive general abilities on their data sheets, mightn't be as good as, say, what a Custode's abilities are. T6, 2-up save, 4-up invoke, and their unit ability helping out with some stuff as well. Their offensive capabilities also come into it. So there might be an offensive capability that you really like that a more Horde style unit actually has that you're able to utilize in a game to great effect, but their defensive profile means that they're a lot weaker when you are exposing them. So you've got to bear in mind how you add them to your list and how you actually expose them. So it really means that you got to consider both sides of the coin, their offensive and defensive profiles and what they're able to do in the game. And that comes in to that Horde versus Elite. Again, it is one of those sliders that you can have armies that are more smack bang in the middle, armies like Necrons, Space Marines are kind of that middle. When you start to go to the Horde side, you've got Genestealer Cult, some of the different Guard builds for Imperial Guard or Astra Militarum as they're now called, or you could end up more on the elite side if you're focusing on like Imperial Guard tank heavy builds, Adeptus Custodes. There's a couple of different factions out there. Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights are definitely more on that elite side of things as well. So that is just something to bear in mind. Now, typically, it's going to be very army dependent as well, as most of these will be. So that's something to bear in mind with the army that you do want to play, is bearing in mind if it actually works for your playstyle. For myself, my personal preference is kind of the middle. That's why I like Space Marines. That's why I like Necrons, because they're middle of the road. They've got some good defensiveness as well as some good offensive capabilities, but at the same time, they're not super weak or super strong in their defense, and the same in their offense. So they're really middle of the road. You can get away with a lot of things that they're able to do, and as well as utilize them quite well in games. Now, the last aspect when it comes to your playstyle is really determining the damage output. Now, this can be construed to just how much damage you're able to do. That's kind of not what I'm getting at with this kind of thought. You've got to factor in what you're going to be playing against with your list. And now different armies will have different ways of dealing with different targets. For example, Space Marines, they can deal with a lot of vehicles with shooting, they can deal with vehicles in close combat, but they can also deal with infantry in shooting and infantry in close combat. You really need to choose how you're going to engage on each of those fronts, whether you're going to choose, some anti-infantry combat to kind of do that counter attack to protect from your anti-tank shooting, and your more heavier shooting units that can deal with a wide variety of targets, for example, Hellblasters, Centurions, Predators, Vindicators, those kind of units that can deal with different targets quite effectively and protect them that way. Or maybe you're someone like Thousand Suns and you've got a ton of flamers, but also a ton of psychic powers and mortal wounds. So it's things like that. So it really comes down to whether you're going to be taking a lot of anti-infantry style combat or shooting, whether you're going to take a lot of anti-monster, anti-vehicle, so more higher quality, or your mortal wound output, all come together into this to ensure that you've actually got an ample damage output for your army to deal with the wide variety of targets. This is where you factor in a lot of those different things in the game. Does the unit have a random number of shots? Does it have weapon abilities like lethal hits, sustained hits 1? Does it do devastating wounds when they wound? Does it automatically hit because it's got the torrent ability? Does it ignore cover? Does it have a way to get rerolls to hit or rerolls to wound from maybe the detachment or the unit's ability or the army rule? Those things really come into play when you're determining whether a unit is going to be good for what you're trying to do damage-wise. Now, for me, typically, I like to be prepared for all situations, commonly called the take-all-comers approach, where you don't really have enough to deal with the skews that are outside of like the 80-90% of the competitive meta in a singles tournament environment compared to, teams. You can really start to skew and use the pairing process in that sense. But again, if you've got a particular way, like you definitely enjoy dealing with harder targets a lot more than, close. You enjoy dealing with tougher targets like knights or custode units and things like that a lot easier than you do, say, orcs or guardsmen horde or Genestealer cults, because your local meta is a lot tougher and a lot more quality rather than the horde style, then of course you're going to maybe adapt that a little bit to engage with that for your local meta. Or if you're playing for a tournament, you're typically going to want to ensure that you're able to cover all your bases as well. So when you're looking at all these different playstyles, no hard and fast rule here. It is just helping you figure out what your personal playstyle is. And I'm sure if anyone watching this video has any other elements, feel free to leave a comment and let us know what other aspects you like to consider, because I want this to be something that you can look at and go, well, actually, what do I enjoy playing? So looking at these 4 different areas: level of mobility, shooting versus melee, elite versus horde, and damage output, I'm really going to share where my playstyle is. I personally enjoy an army that's got good mobility. It's not going to be amazing mobility. It's not going to be super fast and get everywhere it needs to, but it's going to be good mobility. It's going to have some units that can deep strike, units that infiltrate and scout, or just do one of those abilities, or, some faster movement profiles, where I'm going to have enough shooting to deal with anti-infantry and anti-vehicle, anti-monster targets. So I've got tools to deal with everything, having that take all comers style approach from a shooting mentality, whilst also having melee for a counter attack to be able to punch through if I need to, and then having a solid number of units on the field to control the areas on the table where I want to control objectives and get into, different areas. If I want to get engaged on all fronts, for example, I've got, say, a unit of jump pack intercessors or outriders that are fast enough that I can throw them into that table quarter relatively easy to score me some extra victory points. With that being my personal playstyle, it very much explains as to why the current version of my Deathwatch list doesn't work for me, because it's so heavily outside of my playstyle that I lean towards and that I enjoy playing. It's melee heavy compared to being shooting heavy. It is heavily reliant on how good you are at positioning and its mobility, compared to where you just kind of move your units into fire lanes and can kind of control what you see and engage on your terms, as well as then having a couple of mobility units, but really not being super mobile as a list, outside of a couple of units that can advance and charge or doing the teleport as well. So really, that's something else that I really, have to look at. And so I've redesigned the Deathwatch list. I'm not going to share it in this one. Might review it in a future video, kind of where I'm at with Deathwatch, particularly in the new meta. I kind of want to see where things pan out. But yeah, I hope that this has helped you guys to kind of figure out what your play style is and kind of start to frame what you want to enjoy playing. Because the worst thing you can find is that your play style doesn't align with an army that you want to play, or a faction that you enjoy the lore and the miniatures for, and it just doesn't click for you on the table. And at the end of the day, all different aspects of this game come down to enjoyment. And if you're not enjoying playing an army because of the way it plays on the table, then really you might be looking at having to change to a different army, which does suck. So that's why considering this before picking up a new army or jumping over to, one of the new hot factions in the meta might be important for you to realize, because then if it's wildly outside of your typical play style, you're not going to enjoy playing that list, and then you're just going to be doing what I've done for a little while, which is running your face up against the grindstone and really not enjoying yourself and not enjoying playing the game of Warhammer 40k, which we all play for enjoyment first and foremost. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, well, that is it for today's video. I hope you gained something from this one. And really, if you have any thoughts of your own around your own playstyle, or any factors that other people should include when they're trying to figure out how they actually play the game themselves in the way that they enjoy playing the game, please feel free to leave a comment down below, as I said earlier, so that, we can help other competitive players or players starting to get in the competitive scene who are wanting to branch into different armies, understand what their play style is first, so then you can understand how you want to actually play the game and whether a faction is going to be right for you or not. Now, I do want to thank you all for watching today's video. If you did enjoy it, feel free to hit with a like, and if you want to catch more content from us here at the ATWN, feel free to hit that subscribe button, turn on that notification bell, so you'll be notified when we are doing more content here on the network, whether it's more edited videos like these, or it's live tournament coverage that we have from the Australian Warhammer 40k tournament scene. And also, if you want to join us on a weekly basis where I do hobbying session, we also do tournament previews as well over on our Twitch channel. So if you head over to Twitch at the Australis TWN channel, you can join me a couple of nights a week where I'm doing hobbying, or I might be doing a tournament preview with some of the other ATWN team members, interviewing a TO about their upcoming tournament that we are covering over on our YouTube channel as well. And as per usual, I want to give a massive shout out to Tip Top Terrain as one of our channel sponsors, which is absolutely amazing to have them on board, as well as everyone who financially supports us, whether you're a YouTube member, Twitch subscriber, or you're a Ko-Fi member. Your financial contributions allow us to improve the quality of tournament coverage that they provide of the Australian Warhammer 40k tournament scene, and enable us to do so much more outside of that as well. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching today's video, and I hope to catch you in the next one.